Hello and welcome. My name is Bernard Lamberel, and I'm the author of The Covenant on the Origin of the Abrahamic Faith by Means of Deification. In our last video, we looked at how the story of Abraham made more sense when considering a single text, original text, with two characters, an anthropomorphic character and an immaterial deity, and how that story made more sense this way. Now, what about the actual context, not just the text, but the actual context of the Bronze Age in Canaan? So scholars are telling us there was no conquest story and that Israelites essentially came out of the land. And they're virtually indistinguishable from the Canaanites. So perhaps we should look at the Canaanites themselves, and more specifically, the religions that they practiced. So in this video, we're going to look at how Asherah and Baal evolve into Yahweh. Stay tuned. So, what did Canaan look like in the Bronze Age? Well, one of the main religion practice was centered around the veneration and the worship of the dead. That practice was pretty common throughout the Near East. And the dead were believed to live in the underworld, and their spirit could kind of influence things positively or negatively in our lives. And even today, still people believe that they can communicate with the dead and that they can, ask for protection of their dead, their beloved ones, etc. So things were not quite different back then. But the living had to take care of their dead. They had to feed them, and they had to appease them with prayers, songs, libation, etc. Quite often the dead would be buried under the houses themselves. And when people would move around, their bones would be carried away, just like the story of Joseph asking his sons to take care of his bones, or his descendants to take care of his bones. Another important factor that is especially important for us is the fact that territorial rights were very tightly associated with the cult of the ancestor and just the ancestors themselves. And so, since we're looking into the covenant, and as a covenant in exchange for land and protection, then obviously the cult of the dead has significance, as we believe that the king with whom Abraham made his covenant was essentially worshipped as part of the cult of the dead. Now, in addition to the cult of the dead, the Canaanites were believing in what we refer to as a divine council. So at the very top, and so it's like, imagine that the different gods they were worshiping didn't have the same importance, the same significance. So at the very top was God El, and El was kind of the supreme god. And then we had Baal and Asherah. And Baal and Asherah were kind of second in command. They were some of the most important gods, but they were essentially just under El. And then there was a bunch of other gods that was also being referred to and worshipped. Now, Asherah was essentially the Canaanite goddess, and she's known under different names: Asherah, Astarte, Athrat. So those are the names under which there's conflation between the different goddesses. She was believed and referred to as Mother Goddess of Israel, associated with the Tree of Life. She was also, in some texts, she's seen as the consort of El, in other texts as the consort of Baal, and in other texts and other places, she's seen as the consort of Yahweh. So she's kind of been moving around and evolved as the worship of these different gods moved. And if we look throughout the ancient Near East, we can see that a lot of the characteristics that she inherited are similar to Ishtar in Babylon, and Hathor in Egypt. So Hathor and Ishtar are kind of the equivalent goddesses of Asherah in Canaan. Now, in terms of her representation, so as the mother goddess of Israel, associated with the rites of fertility, she was represented as a pole or as a tree of life. And it is believed that the Menorah, which is an important cultic symbol in Judaism, kind of represent Asherah as well. Now, Baal is a generic title, as we've mentioned before, which simply means Lord, can be used as to refer to your husband or to an owner or to, obviously, the god Baal. He was an important, very important Canaanite god. He's believed to be the son of El, and he's the god of war, the god of weather, thunder, etc. He's also associated with fertility. So in the fall, he was believed to go in the underworld, and in the spring, come out of the underworld, and so on. So Baal is the equivalent of Bel, or Marduk, in Babylon, and he's also kind of equivalent or shares similar characteristics with the Egyptian god Seth. Now, one thing that's interesting is that Baal is often represented with horns, and he's often seen or depicted as a bull. Asherah is also occasionally represented with horns. And why is that important? Well, obviously in the story of Exodus, the Israelites keep worshiping the golden calf, and that's likely Baal that is being worshipped again. So just the symbol or the imaging of Baal was often associated with a bull. Now, there are important similarities between Yahweh and Baal. So again, in some text, Yahweh is also depicted with having horns. Yahweh and Baal both shared the same consort, Asherah. Both were worshipped at Shechem in the temple of Baal Berith. And as we can see in the New World Encyclopedia, and a number of other scholars have suggested that Yahweh and Baal were originally both thought as sons of El. And some people believe that the worship of Yahweh and Baal at some point in time was nearly indistinguishable. And indeed, the more we go back in the history of Canaan, the more blurry the line becomes between Yahweh and Baal. Now, if we look at the worship of Baal at Shechem, Shechem is the site of the temple of Baal Berith. And as we saw earlier, the temple of Baal Berith is the temple of the Lord of the Covenant. So Baal Berith, a Berith is a covenant. Tel Belata is the name of that mount where we find the temple of Baal Berith. And Mount Ebal and Mount Gerizim are the two mountains, or the two mounts, that surround the temple. Now, Shechem, if you look in the Bible, in Judges, Shechem is the site where King Abimelech, which would typically be around the 12th century before the Common Era, essentially burnt 1,000 Israelites that had found refuge in the temple of Baal Berith. Now, why would these Israelites refuging in the temple of Baal Berith, and why was King Abimelech trying to destroy them? So obviously the fact that they went into that temple is because that's the religion they were practicing, and Baal Berith was the god they were worshiping at the time, and Abimelech basically was in disagreement with them and killed them. Now we know that idolatry and sacrifices were quite common at Shechem, and we know that the Samaritan lived at Shechem and practiced the ancient pagan cult, but also accepted Yahweh. And we'll talk some more about that later. Now, when we compare that with the worship of Yahweh at Shechem, so we have Baal Berith and we have Yahweh, both being worshipped at Shechem. And we have to keep in mind that Shechem is where Abraham made a covenant with Yahweh. And we would have to set that around, the Jewish tradition. Figure this should be somewhere around 2000 or 1800 century before Common Era. Now we know from the Bible that Jacob was hiding his idols under a tree at Shechem. Shechem is the site where Joshua, and that would have been around the 13th century before the Common Era, where Joshua, essentially standing next to the Ark of the Covenant, read the words of the law. And that's basically after retelling the story from Abraham down, reenacting the covenant. The Shechemites were pagan, and the Israelites both coexisted without problem. We know also that Shechem was a city of the Levitical priesthood, and so it was a very important capital, and it was the capital of Israel before Samaria became that capital. Shechem is also the place of the burial of Joseph, and Shechem is where we can find Jacob's well. So that's interesting. As we will see later, there's a relationship between, or a supposed relationship between Joseph, and the Hyksos kings, and we suspect there are traces of the presence of Hyksos at Shechem, and so those things all tie together. Now, in reference to the horns and of Yahweh, obviously, here in relationship to the covenant transgression, the horns of the altar will be cut off. So obviously the altar had some horns, and we have to believe this was the altar of Yahweh. In Hosea, and it shall be in that day, said Yahweh, that thou shalt call me my husband, and shalt call me no more my Baal. This is Israel talking, but Israel was often referred to as the wife of Yahweh, as an image. But in reality, when you look at the context of the story, it is pretty clear that Hosea here is talking in basically for Asherah. And so it is Asherah that Yahweh is talking to Asherah, saying, you shall call me my husband, and shall call me no more my Baal. So this is an indication that Asherah was actually the wife of Yahweh, which would be referred to as Baal at the time. So there was confusion between Yahweh and Baal. Again, another indication of confusion between Yahweh and Baal in Exodus 6.3, and I appeared unto Abraham, unto Isaac, and unto Jacob by the name of God Almighty. But by my name, Yahweh, was I not known to them. So this is Yahweh speaking to the Israelites and telling them that at the time of Abraham, he was known under a different name. And that name would have been Baal Berith. So the temple in Shechem, these are the ruins that are still visible today and can be visited. And I believe this is the temple, the original temple, and a very important archaeological site where monotheism, or the roots, I should say, of monotheism began. Now, when looking at the timeline, we can see that, again, all the dates do fit. So we can see that Yahweh, the worship of Yahweh, started just before the exile to Babylon, a few centuries before, 1 or 2 centuries before, and that's when the Persians essentially came and took over the land after the Babylonians. And so the Samaritan at the time is where there would have been a split between the Samaritans and the Israelites, or the soon to become Jews. The worship of Baal and Yahweh, so this confusion period, would extend all the way from Exodus. So as of Exodus, before Exodus, it was clearly the worship of Baal and Asherah. From Exodus, we believe that Yahweh was the new deity. And again, as we saw earlier, Yahweh was most likely a compounded deity, integrating or combining the characteristics of Baal and Asherah. And so it makes perfect sense at this point that there was a transition period during which the Israelites wanted to continue worshiping their ancient God, known under the names of Baal and Asherah, with all the ancient practices, while a new set of priests were trying to impose this new compounded deity, super deity, obviously, because it combines the characteristics of the old deities. Yahweh is more powerful, stronger, and a single God that is the God of Israel. And again, in terms of the timeline, we can see how that matched perfectly. Now, why is Elohim plural? Well, Berith suggested that there is correspondences between Canaan and Egypt when Canaan was a vassal state of Egypt. So during pretty much from the exit of when the Ixos were booted out of Egypt, all the way to the Exodus during this period in green here, Egypt was overseeing or putting Canaan under servitude. So Canaan became a vassal state of Egypt during this period. And so there were correspondences in Akkadian language between the kings of Canaan and the pharaohs of Egypt. And Berith suggests that because Elohim is a plural, that means gods, multiple gods with an S, it's a plural. Eloah would be a singular. So Berith detected in the Akkadian text reference to a plural gods, but to a single individual. So if we look at Sari, Belia, Samsia, Ilania, which means the king, my lord, my sun god, my God, with an S. So it's one king, but referred as gods with an S. Or another, here we can see in singular, Anasari Belia, Ilia Samsia, the king, my lord, my God's son. But again, another one here where the plural is used in a singular, Belu Ilanu Napistaka Lisur. May the Lord, gods, again with an S, protect your life. So in this case, it seems pretty clear that Elohim, which signify gods, actually refers to a single individual, which is the king. So this is where Berith suggests that Yahweh, that we're calling Yahweh Elohim, as a sign of plural of majesty. Now, what about the theophoric element Yah? So is Yah a divine name? If we look into the exact same text, just different words. So we saw Sari, Belia, Samsia, Ilania. Now, Belia means my lord in Akkadian. Baal is obviously the god Baal, or Lord, and Yah is basically the possessive, or Belaya in Akkadian means my Lord. So, it is possible that Yah came out of Belaya, or Israelites that read the Akkadian name and thought that Belaya was Baal Yah, as opposed to my Lord. That's one possibility. Now, the theophoric component, Yah, appears in many names in the Bible. And a scholar did investigate that and confirmed that in some instances, the Yah does not refer to a god, but refers to essentially the Akkadian possessive Yah. And one example is El Bel Yah, or Beliah, which could mean my Lord or Lord Yah, or it could be God my Lord or God Lord Yah, depending if you know that this is Akkadian or if you think this is Hebrew. So again, there's confusion in the names, in the Israelites' name, ending or beginning, having either as a suffix or prefix the component Yah. There's not an agreement that Yah always means God here. In some cases, it's the possessive of the Akkadian. And so this is why I believe that Beliah, or Baal Yah, that the component Yah of the name of God might have come from this misunderstanding. So again, in Akkadian, we have Baal Yah, which means Lord Yah. But in Hebrew, Baali means my Lord, and Belial means my Lord God. And in the Bible, we do have Belial as a name that is found there as well, children of Belial. And so, which could refer to, again, the Lord God being Baal. Now, in terms of the etymology of the name, Yahweh, where does Yahweh come from? And Asherah. So we know that in Egypt, Egyptians are using the in front of their cartouche to identify a pharaoh. They use the symbol of Horus, the falcon Horus. And so when we see the falcon, it's the ideogram that represents the pharaoh in Egypt. The dingir symbol is the Assyrian symbol for God. Now, as we saw earlier, Baal and Asherah were often represented with horns. So what if the symbol of the bull head was the equivalent of the Canaan symbol for their god Baal? Now, why is this an interesting proposition? Well, first of all, the first letter of the Proto-Sinaitic alphabet, so the origin of the Hebrew alphabet, used the ox head as the first letter of the alphabet, and it referred to as Alf. And this letter evolved into the modern Aleph, and it also gave our A today. So our letter A comes from the bull's head. It looks even more so like a bull's head if you turn it around than the Hebrew Aleph. But that's where it comes from. Now, Aleph, the letter Aleph in Hebrew, also means one, so it has a value of 1, and it's also the letter of God. So Aleph, if you were to spell and write Aleph in Hebrew, this is how you write it, Aleph, and it has a value of 1,000. Now, in the Bible, there's a strange name called Aluf, and in Genesis 36, when we look at Esau, the brother of Isaac, all his descendants are referred to as Aluf. And this is a name or word that means chief, that is sometimes translated as chief, duke, but it also means a teacher, a champion. And today, Aluf in Hebrew is the highest ranking Israeli Defense Force officer. So the IDF officer is referred to as an Aluf instead of lieutenant or general. So Aluf is a very important name, and Aleph means God. Now, it's all related. And so, again, this is Genesis 36, and we can see in these names, and these are the names of the Alufs, which is typically translated as chief or duke in English. that came of Esau according to their families and after their places and by their names. So Aluf Timnah, Aluf Alva, Aluf Jethet, etc. So Aluf was a title that was used back then for some important people. What about Aluf Sarah? Now, Aluf Sarah, if we were to write Aluf Sarah in Proto-Sinaitic, if we were going to use the ox head or the Aleph symbol as the symbol of God, a little bit like Pharaoh's, we're using the falcon. So Aluf Sarah is, in modern Hebrew, Aleph Sarah, which is Asherah. And so I believe because Sarah or Shera spells exactly the same. There was no vowels in ancient Hebrew. And so Aluf Sarah or Asherah, and there was no space between names, between letter back then. So there's absolutely no difference between Aluf Sarah and Asherah. And I believe that Asherah originates from this spelling. Now, if we come back and look at the divine council, which is the head of the Ugaritic pantheon, so we have El, the supreme God, and then we have Baal and Asherah. So if we're talking about Baal Berith, the Lord of the covenant, which is also, as we've seen in the previous section, Israel's progenitor. So Baal is actually the one who fathered Isaac with Sarah. So it makes sense that Asherah would be referred to as Aluf Sarah, Queen Mother of Israel and the Tree of Life. She gave birth to all the descendants. She's the mother of Israel. And when you understand that Baal Berith and Aluf Sarah is the couple that essentially gave rise to the Israelites and the dynasty, then you can see that they were elevated or worshipped both on earth and in heaven. So we have a mapping, we have the same structure on earth and in heaven with this comparison. Now, Asherah would also be referred to as Baalah. Baalah is the wife. So Baal is the Lord, and Baalah would be the wife, the feminine equivalent, which means princess, but would also be used as consort, etc. So if Asherah, as we've seen, is the consort of Baal, she could have bore the title Baalah. Now, we know that in ancient Near East, and specifically in Egypt and in Canaan, there are examples of numerous compounded deities. Now, a compounded deity is essentially a deity made out of multiple deities. So when you combine the names of multiple deities, you're creating a new deity that combines the characteristics of all these deities. And so we have some example here in Canaan of Melech Ashtart, Eshmun Ashtart, Eshmun Melkart, Askun Adar, Ashtar Shamash. And then we have in Egypt, we have Amun Re or Ra Horus Aten. So these are deities that are single deities. So Amun Re is one deity. And people would continue worshipping Amun separately and Re or Ra separately. But the deity Amun Ra was thought to be more powerful. Now, there are other examples here of El and Atharat. So El, W, Atharat. So the W here, the W, is the conjunction. So it's the and. And Dagon, W, Baal, is basically, again, the conjunction is this new deity that is the deity formed by Dagon and Baal. Now, if there were such deities, it is very possible that we had a deity called Lord Yah and Aluf Sarah, right? So Lord Yah and Aluf Sarah would be in Hebrew Baal Yah, W Asherah, or W Baalah. And so Baal Yah Asherah in Hebrew, and reading from right to left, Baal Asherah. If you change Asherah by Baala, her equivalent name or title, you have Baal Baala. And if you remove the component Baal from the name, so this is the component Baal, what you're left with is Yahweh. Yahweh. And this is the tetragrammaton that I believe comes from this name, Baal Asherah, or Baal Baala. And so, because this is exactly who the Israelites were worshiping. They were worshiping Lord Yah and his consort Asherah. So, here's an interesting note from Jewish Woman's Archive, and I'll read it. One possibility is that in royal circles, especially in the southern capital city of Jerusalem, the cult of Asherah was particularly attractive to the king's mother. Not only was the queen's mother's position in the palace generally paralleled by Asherah's position as mother goddess in the heaven, but also the queen's mother's status as the wife of the king's father suggests an affinity to Asherah's cult. This is because Southern royal ideology typically described the king's metaphorical father as Yahweh. For those ancient Israelites who saw Asherah as Yahweh's consort, this should suggest a correspondence between the queen mother, the wife of the king's biological father on earth, and Asherah, the wife of Yahweh, who was the king's metaphorical father in the heavens. So, I think this is a great example, and it really describes what we just talked about. So here's one more interesting evidence pointing to Baal and Baal Berith. So in the Midrash, Beelzebub, which means Lord of the Fly, is said to be Baal Berith. And it is said that Beelzebub, that people are essentially keeping of the size of a fly. And now in Egypt, people were using amulets that often had the shape of a scarab. And scarabs were also popular in Canaan during the Bronze Age. And so if the scarab, the amulet, had the shape of a scarab, on the verso of the amulet, there's often either the name of deity or some text. But these scarabs could be very small and could look like a fly. And so if a scarab had the name Baal Berith, because they were worshiping and they were using scarabs, the same way Christians are using little medals for their saints today. So people back then were using scarabs with the name of their god. And so it is no wonder that in the Midrash, these would be condemned as Beelzebub being the demon, but in reality, all it was probably just a scarab with the name of Baal Berith. Now, this concludes our video on how Yahweh was formed from the merging of Baal and Asherah. And when you think about it, if Yahweh is a compounded deity that integrates the characteristics of Baal and Asherah, it is a more powerful deity. And this is what we see in the Bible. And we see in the Bible that the Israelites keep falling back for worshiping Baal and Asherah. And actually, the worship of Asherah was maintained throughout many centuries after this merging took place. Now, if Yahweh is a compounded deity, it makes perfect sense that it is Yahweh Elohim with an S and a plural. And so Yahweh Elohim means Yahweh, this compounded deity, is multiple gods. Now, in our next video, if our premise is correct, if we if Abraham didn't make a covenant with a king? Wouldn't it be interesting to look into history and try to find who that king might have been? Now, this is a bit like looking for a needle in a haystack, but there is interesting evidence in our next video. So I hope to see you there. Thanks.